Good morning, evening, or afternoon, everybody. It is me, your boy TPT, coming at you not live and not from Twitch TV. I hope you all having a fantastic day today. So, this is going to be another one of my EU4 advanced guides. This one's going to be on Vassal meta, both in single player and multiplayer. But obviously, before we do get into it, I have to give the shout outs, of course. First of all, obviously to the E4 Casuals Discord, as well as the E4 Australia Discord. Both of those great places to hang out. E4 Casuals is for Europeans and Americans. E4 Australia is obviously for Australians. And as long as you guys avoid the politics channel, you should be just fine. So, jumping right into it, with the introduction of governing capacity, the need for vassals has decreased significantly. However, they do still have one or two main purposes. Which obviously I'll be covering in this video. So first of all, I'm going to cover single player, and single player is normally very simple. The reason you use vassals is to save on administrative power. So typically, you don't really care who they are. The only thing you're really looking at is their cause. So I think the best example would actually be typically maybe if I'm playing as, say, the Ottomans. So what I'll do is I'll often declare war on AQ. I'll snake down to Raqqa, and then I'll release Syria outside of AQ, because Syria has a significant bunch of cores present within both Fadl and within the Mamluks. So if you have a look here, you'll see they have a bunch of cores. They also have one on QQ too. And see, this is very rich land here, you know. This is, you know, you're looking at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, you know, 90, 100, you know, over 100 dev of land. And so, you know, realistically, that would be pretty expensive to core. However, if you just feed it to your vassal, instead of spending admin points on it, you can spend diplomatic points instead, which allows you to expand into other places using those admin points you would have used otherwise, or picking up your technology or your ideas, or, you know, obviously there's other things as well, like stability if you really need it, etc, etc. So typically, when you're looking at single player, the main thing you use your vassals for is essentially so that you don't have to feed it yourself. Another good example is Austria. You know, say you're playing as Austria, you revoke the privilegia. With this one right here, it basically makes everyone that agrees to it in the empire your vassal. And then you can feed them land. You know, it's a good trick for a world conquest essentially, because you can expand very, very quickly. You don't have to spend a lot of points yourself. You just divide it up between the, you know, 3 dozen vassals you'll get, and then you just blow up. And then, you know, once you're all finished with it, you just, you know, Renovato Imperi, and boom, you annex every single one of them instantly. So that's typically the main strategy. You know, you can do a similar thing with the Shogun mechanics in Japan, although I believe that one will be getting patched out for non-Japanese vassals after this patch, after Leviathan, because you used to be able to essentially turn non-Japanese countries into daimyos. Like, you know, you could, if you fucking wanted to, you could turn the Pope into a daimyo. Obviously it's complicated, but you can do it, you know, because they hadn't really considered that fact. And so they will be, unfortunately, removing that feature in the, you know, unfortunately they will be removing that feature in the next patch in Leviathan. But you can still do it with your existing vassals, as long as obviously you can keep them in line, you know, because they will try and murder each other. That is just an inevitability when you're playing in Japan. Now, multiplayer is a bit different. There's really not as much of a priority placed on vassals from the midpoint onwards, mid-game should I say. Obviously you do still use them in the early game in order to minimize your admin spending, because you still want to be expanding as much as possible. But, you know, as is with multiplayer, typically your expansion speed tends to halt quite rapidly once you meet the mid game, and once you start, essentially bordering other people. And so you really sort of cut it back at that point. I normally like to keep a vassal or two around just in case. Typically one with a high amount of fort defense. So the first ones that come to mind would be Georgia, Rasids, or even like something like Prussia, if you can manage to get them to form. Typically this is just more of a handy sort of thing. What you'll do is when you're occupying other countries, you will let, say Georgia is my vassal, you would transfer occupation of the forts over to said vassal, and that way they would both be paying for it, and also it would receive the fort defense of the vassal. So, you could be looking at 120% fort defense mountain or something, which is, that's really not something I would like to be pushing through as a player in a player war. That's just something I'd much rather avoid. So you can also use them to obviously choke off important points, like feeding Georgia this general area, placing some mountain forts, like around Guria, Imereti, Kanzia, like just around this general area, placing a bunch of mountain forts, because obviously the players, if they want to come up through this direction, they'd have to go through Georgia. But generally, I mean, you don't really tend to use vassals too much. You don't need to do it with Georgia. You can just take it yourself. It's just that you probably want to be able to get as high of a fort defense. Plus, obviously, you'd also have to be paying it for yourself instead of just having a vassal you can, save from bankruptcy every now and then. So yeah, generally, vassals aren't too much of a concern in E4 anymore. Now that the governing cap has existed. You can also use it to minimize going over your gov cap, but realistically, if you go over it a bit, it's not too big of a deal. Plus, with multiplayer, it's often a lot harder to go over your gov cap because, again, your expansion will be much more limited. So obviously, I would still consider it as single player. If you're starting to hit like 200% governing capacity, you probably might want to consider getting a vassal or two. As well as client states are still useful. If you want to just eat massive swaths of land in one go, you can feed some of it to yourself, and you can feed it to a client state too. Essentially, just to minimize the overextension, because obviously you don't really want to be going any point above 100% overextension. So if you just feed part of it or all of it to a client state, then they'd only be getting 100% overextension in their small land, or obviously you'd be avoiding the issue entirely. So they're they can also be quite useful, although it really just depends on where exactly you're placing them. Though typically the whole issue of only being able to place them in your home continent again isn't too much as big of a deal in multiplayer, because once again, limited expansion once you get to the mid to late game, so you will probably still have significant amounts of territory to conquer in your home continent at any point in time, unless of course you're just absolutely completely crushing the multiplayer, which I've never ever come across in a competitive or casual game for that matter. There's always stuff you can conquer in your home continent, and there's always places for you to use client states. So look, I don't really have much else to cover. Again, vassal meta just isn't really a huge thing at the moment. I just wanted to, to talk about this topic anyway, just so people are aware of that fact. It used to be very important back when you still had your state caps. It used to be very, very important back then. You really needed to use a lot of vassals in order to be able to continue expanding even in multiplayer. But with the introduction of governing capacity, it's much more of a soft cap on your expansion. And so because of that, obviously they become a lot less important. So I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you did, obviously be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit that motherfucking like button. Give me some of that sweet YouTube algorithm. Obviously, comment if you have any questions. I pretty much always answer comments that are questions. Hell, even if they're not a question, I normally reply to them anyway, because I just have that ability to. I'm just built different like that. So I'll catch you all next time. Peace.